You shouldn't need psychic powers to know Georgia will almost certainly be picked number one when the media vote next week at SEC Media Days for the conference's predicted order of finish. The better question is, who's going to be number two in those predicted order of finish? Who's going to be number three? Welcome into this edition of SEC Football Unfiltered, our podcast from the USA Today Network. I'm Blake Toppmeyer alongside John Adams. Today on the episode, we'll be taking a look at what those predicted order of finish might look like next week in Dallas at SEC Media Days, and also how we'd be filling out the top of our ballots, and also a look at how Kalen DeBoer is handling the year one pressure of replacing, I should say, Nick Saban at Alabama. John, welcome in. SEC Media Days next week, first time ever in Dallas. Pretty excited for that? Or are you mourning for the days when this event was penciled in Hoover, Alabama every year?
Well, I always like going to Hoover, not out of this great love for Alabama. Alabama's a fine state, but what I liked about it was that Hoover knew how to do this. It was set up. Had plenty of repetition. You knew what you were going to get. I liked the Winfrey Hotel. There was a media headquarters for the event. You had radio row. Everything was really lined up effectively. You had really good restaurants in the area. Couldn't ask for any more than that. I mean, it's not as though we ask for a lot. Just kind of simple conveniences and pleasures is fine for us. And so that was, I liked it. And I didn't like it in Atlanta. My shower didn't work in the hotel effectively. So things like that.
That's the SEC's fault, I'm sure.
Of course it is. Who else do you want me to blame? Me?
Yeah. Well, I want to get to the predicted finish order here in a moment, John, but I do kind of think, the fact that Media Days is in Dallas, it's really not a big deal, but you add it up and you start looking at things. It just seems like the SEC is going all out to welcome Texas into this conference. So we talked about this on the episode last week. They tweet right at midnight to welcome Texas into the conference on July 1. They tweeted to welcome in Oklahoma at 12:01, 1 minute later. And then the SEC Network went to Austin first for a live broadcast before it went to Norman. And now, the SEC Media Days, which for so many years had always been in Alabama before taking its show on the road in recent years to Atlanta and Nashville. And now, lo and behold, year one, Texas is in the league. And hey, looky there, Media Days is in Dallas. I mean, I think there was a thought when Texas came into the SEC of like, oh, this is going to keep that Longhorn ego in check. They're stepping into the big bad SEC where, no one member is bigger than the conference. The SEC is the show. Texas is not the show. Well, that may be the case in reality and long term, but I don't know. I mean, I feel like the SEC is really bending over backwards, going out of its way to put on the dog and pony show for the Longhorns as they enter the conference. And then it's like, oh, yeah, Oklahoma, welcome into you guys, too.
Well, think about it. It's Texas has four of the top 11 most populated cities in the country. So you look at the numbers, you think about TV eyes, all that kind of good stuff. I wonder do you think ESPN or ABC influenced the decision at all to go to Dallas, Texas for Media Days? I
would have to think they were involved in the conversation at the very least. Had a seat at that table when that decision was being made.
Well, the funny thing about it, though, and it was the same way in Atlanta when it's there. Atlanta, as much of a presence as the Georgia Bulldogs have during football season, Atlanta's a pro town. Dallas is a pro town. I mean, huge interest in college football. But do you think, what percentage of the population of Dallas, Texas is going, oh man, did you hear? The SEC media are going to be here all week. Oh man, what hotel is that? I don't know. You think we could get Blake Toppmeyer's autograph, that SEC columnist for USA Today? I don't know, but it's worth a try.
Yeah, I don't think anybody's
Uh,
saying that. More likely, they'd want your
yeah.
autograph. You're the two-time published author. I've only published one book, John, so I'm living in your shadow. But I mean, I think to the point you're kind of making there, like I think it's a mistake for the SEC to take this show on the road. I mean, in Alabama, in Hoover, you were treated like a big deal. I don't really think this event is a big deal. It's a bunch of coaches taking 30 minutes at the lectern and running through their depth chart and trying to dodge questions. But in Hoover, it does get the spotlight treatment. I mean, fans come out to the Winfrey Hotel, gather in the lobby. I mean, it is a little bit of a red carpet type situation. Like you mentioned, they had Radio Row set up right in there, the first floor of the hotel. It felt like, sort of like a mini version of Super Bowl media days to a certain extent. And I just feel like as it moves on to these bigger cities, these metropolitan areas, I mean, it really gets dwarfed. I remember covering the event in Atlanta and was having a drink one night, and the bartender said, what are you in town for? I said, SEC Media Days. And she said, oh, is that convention that's going on down the road? I mean, she had no idea what it was. In Hoover, I mean, they'd put signs in the bar windows that would say, welcome, SEC Media. It may have been the only time in history people were excited to have us anywhere. But in Hoover, the event was treated like such a big deal. I just think it gets lost in some of these bigger cities, these bigger venues. I mean, Dallas is aren't they hosting the MLB All-Star game at the same time Media Days is going on? I mean, what's a bigger deal, the MLB All-Star game or Media Days? Of course, it's the All-Star game. I mean,
Oh,
I just think
forgot about that.
you're living in the shadows when you try to take this event on the road. It ought to be in Alabama every year. That's where the conference is headquartered, like it or not. And Birmingham, that's where you're going to get the most attention on this event. I think it's a mistake, but we'll leave that part there and move on to the order of finish and not make this a full episode bashing the SEC's decision to have media days in Dallas. So, any mystery at the top, John, or am I safe in saying that Georgia, they're going to be number one in this predicted order of finish, and that's where both you and I would have them? Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think if you based on chalk and based on what's transpired recently. I mean, you often in the olden days, or should I say the Nick Saban days, it was almost a knee-jerk reaction. You picked Alabama and then Georgia, then that they reversed order and it became Georgia. I wrote I guess I think there are more contenders than I can remember seeing, and part of that has to do with expansion. I think a lot of people are going to make a case for Texas. And when the vote is taken at SEC Media Days, because you're going to have a heavy influx of Texas media people, I think the vote between Georgia and Texas could be very close. I would still give an edge to Georgia. But yeah, I think there's going to be a strong Texas vote. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the Texas media are more big picture oriented than I'm thinking. But, you look at preseason magazines, you look what Texas has returning. It just made the playoff. When Texas is good, it can be really good. So I think you're going to have perhaps a close vote. Could still go Georgia's way. But see, I wonder. Go ahead.
Yeah, that would be interesting, John, because that would show that there's more new guard media covering SEC Media Days than old guard if Texas is close to claiming that number one spot. That would tell me that there's a lot of Texas-based media covering this event for the first time and maybe showing a little hometown bias, voting the Longhorns number one. Whereas I think the old guard of SEC media at this event, they're going to almost without thinking say, Georgia's number one. But I mean, if you look at it through the lens of last season, Texas made the college football playoff. Georgia didn't. Now, who would have won in a head-to-head? We don't know. Texas went into Alabama, won in Tuscaloosa, didn't play Georgia. They'll play this season. But, yeah, you might be right there. Maybe I am taking it for granted that Georgia is going to be number one in this poll. I think Georgia is going to be number one in the preseason AP and coaches polls. I think it'll be Georgia 1, Ohio State 2. or some order of that. So I would think if you're going to be possibly preseason number one in the nation, you'd be picked to win the SEC. But you might be right. With this event being hosted in Dallas, you're going to have a lot of Texas media on hand for this. That might help pull some votes into Texas's direction. So you say Georgia will be number one, but you think Texas will be close behind to number two. I'm curious, though, on your
Yes.
ballot, who would you have as your number two in your predicted order finish?
I would have Ole Miss. The more I look at Ole Miss, the more I read about it. It's not one of those historically great programs, but I'm trying to be current here. And I just think this is a very, very good Ole Miss team. Ole Miss was really good last year, though you couldn't tell it. You covered that game against Georgia. It was 52-17. But you look back in the year before that, Ole Miss won 10 games. But I think this could be Ole Miss's best team in more than 60 years. I think this team has the makings of a national champion. It could do that, and I think it has a manageable schedule. Certainly, the Georgia game would be the greatest challenge, but when I look at, say, Ole Miss's schedule and compare it to some other teams like maybe Texas or LSU or Oklahoma's, I kind of like Ole Miss in there. So I would put Ole Miss second. I don't think Ole Miss will finish. I certainly don't think the media poll will have Ole Miss second. No.
Okay, so you would have Ole Miss second. I would go with the prevailing logic. I would have Texas second. I really like their amount of returning production. They have a veteran offensive line. They're proven at quarterback. Have some questions on the defensive front. That defensive front was so good last year. They got to replace quite a bit of production in that particular area. But overall, I like their returning production. I don't think it's going to be a huge transition for them coming into the SEC because of the way their roster is built. If they would have come into the SEC a couple years ago, I don't think they were physically ready for it at that point. But I think they've fortified themselves at the line of scrimmage, particularly on the offensive line. They have an offensive line that most teams this side of Georgia would really envy, I think. So I have Texas to we'll go through our top five, running out through number five. I'll have Ole Miss on my list, but I don't have them as high as you do. I know you're really bullish on the Rebels and have been pounding that drum for a while now. So let's move on to number three. Who do you got on your number three line?
Well, I'm not far off on your Texas pick. I agree with what you're saying about Texas. In fact, there's some similarities in Texas and Ole Miss. Maybe not football tradition, but Texas with a proven quarterback, Ole Miss with a proven quarterback. Texas has bolstered its receiving core where there was great attrition, but it added some guys through the transfer portal that will make it formidable again. Ole Miss probably has the best receiving core in the SEC. And Ole Miss also has it has one of the most experienced offensive lines in the country. It's one of several schools that cherry-picked that Washington offensive line that won the Joe Moore Award last year for the best offensive line. And those guys, they did not stick with the Huskies on their move to the Big Ten. Maybe they didn't like those cross-country flights, but some of them have landed in, one in Alabama and Ole Miss has one. So, yeah, there are some similarities, I think. And I kind of wonder, I wonder about Ole Miss's secondary. I wonder a little about Texas's secondary.
Okay, so we're pretty similar on Texas. You got the Longhorns at number three on yours. I got Texas number two on mine. I'm wondering if this raises a little controversy with you, my number three. And I feel like I'm going out on a limb a little bit here, but I like the way the schedule sets up for LSU. Now, LSU, I think, has a tough schedule, but they have most of their toughest games at home, and that's why I give them the edge here at number three for LSU. They play Alabama at home. They play Ole Miss at home. They play Oklahoma at home. So those are three important swing games on the LSU schedule. All three of them being at home are huge. Now, this predicted order of finish, this is not an overall record prediction. It's not factoring in non-conference games. And LSU opens the season against Southern Cal and Las Vegas. I mean, that is a tough opener for LSU, whereas, say, Ole Miss, they don't have the equivalent of that on their non-conference schedule. So I think it's possible that Ole Miss finishes the season with a better record than LSU, but that LSU would finish higher in the conference standings because their non-conference schedule is tougher. So strictly through the lens of predicted order of finish in the SEC, I'm going in on LSU because of that schedule, with how many of their tough conference games are played at home. A couple of questions with LSU, right? I mean, they were a disaster on defense last year. And a big part of me thinks they can't possibly be any worse on defense this year, right, than they were last season, right? I have to think that defense is going to be somewhat better. And they hired Blake Baker, the defensive coordinator who had success at Missouri and turned around Missouri's defense. He's now Brian Kelly's defensive coordinator at LSU. I think he's going to be an asset. The other question is, okay, even if the defense improves a little, will the offense come back to the pack a little bit, losing Jaden Daniels? I think it's plausible. I mean, LSU had the best offense in the country last year. However, I'm pretty high on Garrett Nussmeier. So I don't know if the offense will be quite as good as last year, but I still think with Nussmeier at the controls, the offense will be really strong. I think the defense will be somewhat better, competent enough, and because of those home games in the crucial swing games in the SEC, that's why I have LSU at number 3, and I'm curious whether you think that's a little bit controversial to have LSU that high.
Yeah, based on mine, it is. I don't have LSU in my top 5. However, you've made a persuasive argument that perhaps I should have, and you bring up the schedule. I think it's good when you look at LSU's schedule and you say Southern California, an opener in Vegas, neutral site, UCLA at home. Big name programs, but how good will those programs be this year? I don't think they will be top of the SEC good. Southern Cal won't be. I think it'll be good, but I don't think this will be one of Southern Cal's best teams. UCLA, Chip Kelly left a head coaching job to be a defensive coordinator. I mean, what does that tell you? So UCLA, named school, easy win in Tiger Stadium. And I love the way the schedule is set up. Before the Ole Miss game, you play South Alabama. You have 2 weeks for the Alabama game. You play Vanderbilt the week before you play Oklahoma. So when you look at LSU's big games, there's not a real tough back-to-back challenge there. So I kind of like that. I just thought LSU's offense was so good last year. There's going to be a drop-off. And the defense will be better, but I don't know if they'll be good enough to still. I just don't. That's a puzzling team to me. And you've chosen to take the optimistic scenario for LSU. I'm not that optimistic about LSU, and I like Nussmeier. I like the way he throws the ball, but he doesn't scare me. If I were a defensive coordinator, he wouldn't scare me the way Jaden Daniels did. I mean, I'd be terrified going against Jaden Daniels when you got 2 first-round NFL draft picks at wide receiver. LSU doesn't have that anymore.
Yeah, that's all fair, and I do think the offense is almost certainly going to take a step back. Now, it can take a step back and still be a top 10 offense in the nation. I mean, like I said, it was the number 1 offense in the nation last year, but it's almost certainly going to take a step back. And for them to finish number 3, I mean, that defense has to be markedly better. It was an absolute disaster last year. It doesn't have to be number 1 defense in the conference, but it has to have a pulse. It has to be middle of the pack level of defense if LSU is going to finish number 3 in the conference. So I do think that is stepping out on a limb there. I won't deny it.
I think one of the real keys to me for LSU could be at running back. I don't look at it. It's not a great running back depth chart. I mean, Josh Williams is your lead running back, doesn't really move the needle. But I wonder about Caleb Jackson behind him. I saw him late game in a couple of one-sided games and like what I saw. Just flashes. But if he turns out to be a big deal as a running back, then that would resolve that issue, and I would feel better about LSU because
All right, well,
right
I'm
now.
going to get to my
Go
Yeah,
ahead.
I'm going to get to my number 4, John, because it's a team that's already come up, and then we'll hit up your number 4.
Okay.
I have Ole Miss as my number 4. I really like Ole Miss, maybe just not quite as much as you do, but I mean, every year Lane Kiffin loads up in the transfer portal. I think he did a better job on that front than ever before, though, this year, because in past years, he's brought in a lot of offensive skill talent. And he did some of that this year too. But where they really got better were the defensive additions he made. I mean, guys with SEC experience on defense, including Walter Nolan on the defensive line. I mean, just several plug and play type of players that can help elevate that Ole Miss defense. You mentioned Jackson Dart back at quarterback. Now, they did lose Quinshawn Judkins, their star running back. And I think the argument for that is, well, if you didn't lose Judkins, would you have been able to get all of that transfer talent that Judkins would have cost Ole Miss some cashola in the NIL department? And with him walking out the door to Ohio State, there's a theory that freed up some funds to go get in some of this transfer talent we're talking about, particularly on defense. So overall, I think they're, a well-rounded team. The thing I worry about them a little bit is they got Georgia on the schedule. We saw how that went last year. Not good for Ole Miss. Also, that LSU game is just a swing game for both programs, I think, right in the middle of the season. And the reason I give LSU the nod over Ole Miss in my pecking order is simply because of where that game is played. If that game was going to be in Oxford, I would have Ole Miss as my number 3 and LSU as my number 4. But because that game's in Baton Rouge, I have LSU 3, Ole Miss 4. Ole Miss won it last year when it was in Oxford. LSU won it the year before when it was in Baton Rouge. So I really look at those teams very closely together. And I think some of the same storylines, too. I mean, we're talking about LSU's defense has to be better this year. Ole Miss's defense wasn't the disaster that LSU's was last year, but it was pretty average. I mean, Lane Kiffin, to this point in his tenure, that's been the missing piece. He has not had a top 5 SEC defense at this point. If he has a top 5 SEC defense this year, they could be in Atlanta, which I know you have him, penciled in as a strong possibility for Atlanta. So Ole Miss is my number 4. I know you got them at number 2. Curious to hear who do you have as your number 4?
I have Tennessee. I like we talked a lot about schedule, and let's face it, that's a big factor in where teams might finish. I look at Tennessee's schedule, and I see in the SEC Oklahoma, Georgia, and Alabama. Those are the challenges. Kind of right off Georgia and Athens, split with Oklahoma and Alabama. You're 10-2. I mean, this is obviously a good case scenario, but that to me could get you in the college football playoff. Won't get you in it for the SEC championship game. But I think now is the time to play Oklahoma. I wouldn't want to play them in 5 years, because if Brent Venables is still the head coach there in 5 years, that means he's doing a really good job and Oklahoma's really good. If he's not there, that means Oklahoma's hired somebody better. I mean, Oklahoma's not going to have a lot of patience with mediocrity. It never has. So even though you're playing in Norman, to me, that's a winnable game for Tennessee. And really the only other game that I consider kind of a toss-up would be NC State, a neutral site game in Charlotte early in the year. But I think Tennessee, to me, is going to be a little better on defense. I think its defensive front is fine. I think it will handle the run. Don't know if it'll handle the pass, but I think it's going to be able to score enough to surpass what the opponent scores, perhaps even against a weak secondary. That's what we saw in 2022. I think this team is more like the 22 team that went 11-2 than the 23 team that went 9-4.
Yeah, you're a little more bullish on Tennessee than I am, although we're not that far off. I know we're both big believers in the redshirt freshman quarterback, Nico Iamaleava, who took the reins in the bowl win against Iowa. What concerns me and why I don't have Tennessee in my top 5 is that road game against Oklahoma. I agree with what you're saying. Like, if there's a time to play Oklahoma, it is now. However, I look at it more from a Tennessee lens. The last couple years, it's been a bit of a struggle for them on the road. 2 years ago, they lost at South Carolina late in the season. That loss factored into them not making the college football playoff. Last year, they go to Missouri and get trounced in Columbia. Like, there's just been that stub your toe road game on the schedule, and I don't think they're beating Georgia or Alabama, although the Alabama game is not a given. Neither of those games are a given, but Georgia on the road, I think that one probably goes into the loss category. Alabama could be a coin flip. And what you're saying is between Alabama and Oklahoma, they just need to get one of those two. They can get to 10-2, be at this positioning in the SEC where you have them at number 4, be in the college football playoff. I just think there's a possibility they lose both those games with the fact of Oklahoma being on the road and looking through the lens of it has as good as Josh Heupel has been for Tennessee these last three years. They've been awesome at Neyland Stadium, but I even think back to his first season in what became a not very good Florida team. They lost at the Swamp, so I just have some concerns with Tennessee on the road, and that's why I don't have them in my top 5.
I think if you like Tennessee to make the college football playoff, if you like Tennessee to be really good this year and a better version than what we saw in last year's model, a lot of that has to do with Nico at quarterback. And maybe I've gone too far in my assessment of him, but I think he's going to be an immediate star. I think he has everything it takes to be a star in this league. And I think when you have that kind of quarterback, it really helps soften up some of those road challenges. When you got a big time player at quarterback, I just think that makes a difference in every aspect of the game. And maybe a lesser quarterback would struggle more on the road, whereas a really good one can handle that. All that goes with a hostile environment, can handle the noise, the pressure, the environment. And so, yeah, my assessment of Tennessee being number 4 in the conference is really kind of leans heavily on Nico being really good.
All right, so we've made it through each of our top 4, and neither of us have mentioned Alabama. I mean, that would have been criminal back when Nick Saban was coach. They would have, especially when the event was in Hoover, they would have had a couple security guards come and hauled us away. We would have been spending the night in the Hoover jail to not have Alabama in our top 4 while Nick Saban was the coach. But it's a new day at Alabama with Kalen DeBoer as the coach. I'm pretty high on DeBoer. I haven't got to Alabama yet, though. Neither of you. Are you going with Alabama as your number 5, or are you looking more at, say, Missouri, Texas A&M, or Oklahoma?
No, I like Alabama at number 5. I wouldn't go any lower than that. And it's interesting. You mentioned 3 more teams. That kind of points to something I've been saying ever since this league expanded. There's just more good teams in the conference now. And I think you can say 9 teams this season could be in the running for the playoff. 9 teams, their fan bases, and this is so important in the SEC. for fans are usually optimistic this time of year, where they can be optimistic and stuff. So, well, yeah, if this happens and that happens, I could see our team making the playoff. It's not really far fetched. So, when you say the fifth best team in the SEC, excuse me, that means more than it used to. So, yeah, I'm downgrading Alabama some from losing Nick Saban, but the idea that it's fallen from first to fifth, that's not a huge plummet. Just the way the league is set up right now. I mean, if Alabama finished much higher, if it ended up second, I wouldn't be shocked.
Yeah, I have Alabama as my number 5 as well. So we both snuck them in there in the last spot in our top 5, which could be really important because I think 5 is sort of that number for the SEC in terms of qualifying teams that they can realistically qualify for the playoff. I think it's either going to be 4 or 5 for the SEC. We've talked about this before because when you start adding up 3 or 4 teams from the Big Ten, those at-large spots start getting allocated in a hurry. And then what happens with Notre Dame? Do they get in or not? So 5 could be the number for the SEC. So finishing in the top 5 in the standings could be really, really important. I have Alabama 5 as well. I really like Jalen Milroe's chances of flourishing here in year 1 with DeBoer. I mean, he really, really improved as last season went along. I think he's going to be one of the top quarterbacks in the country this year. I think working with DeBoer could help him. DeBoer has a nice track record for quarterbacks. The questions I have with Alabama, they're not as well stocked at the skill positions, talking running back and wide receiver, as they historically had been throughout the Saban era. And it is a really new look defensive secondary. I mean, they lost a ton of talent in the back end of their defense, including Caleb Downs, who transferred, and then a handful of other guys who are off to the NFL. And that was usually so reliable throughout the Saban tenure, right? You knew they were going to be strong in the back end. You knew the defense was going to be strong on the whole, but they lost some pass rushers and they lost several guys in the defensive backfield. So those are kind of my questions with Alabama, but I still think there's a lot of talent there. The offensive line is pretty veteran. I like Milroe. Schedule is pretty tough. It's not maybe as tough as a few others, sort of a middle of the pack type of schedule. And I agree with you. It wouldn't totally surprise me if Alabama's in Atlanta as one of the 2 teams in the SEC championship, or it wouldn't totally shock me either if Alabama misses the playoffs in DeBoer's first season.
Yeah, I think we're right in sync on Alabama. The points you made, strengths, weaknesses, and I know you championed Kalen DeBoer's hiring. I don't know if you actually got a percentage, if he gave you a signing bonus when Alabama hired him, but I wouldn't have had a problem if he did. I mean, I thought you made a great case for hiring him. The one thing I think the record is his record is 104-12. I think that's something like very close, if not right on it. That really gets my attention. I don't care if he was coaching in Sioux Falls or Idaho Falls or wherever he was coaching at some far-flung place. That record, because you figure the teams he's playing, it's not as like he's playing teams with similar resources in these leagues. So he didn't just win, he dominated. And he did well at Fresno State. So the more I look at Alabama, the more I look at Kalen DeBoer, the more I feel better about them. And having them in 5th in the SEC, I wouldn't have any problem if they rose much higher than that. I think they have that kind of potential. I just, you point out the secondary, that was Nick Saban's position.
So while we're on the topic of Kalen DeBoer, I had an interview with the first-year Alabama coach recently, and he said a couple things that stood out to me. And you can find a link to my column off that conversation with DeBoer in the podcast description for this episode. That column is linked in the description for the pod. But a couple things that he said stood out John, when I asked him about the idea of making the college football playoff in year one and whether that should be a realistic expectation for his first season. That's a question that a lot of coaches kind of get squeamish about. They don't really like being pinned down to concrete expectations. They want to start talking about process and all that type of stuff. But
culture.
Culture. Yeah, guys working hard in a room. Got to get better every day. That type of thing. But DeBoer met it head on, and his comment was, quote, "This program has that expectation of being championship caliber and being involved in the playoff every single year. And so easier said than done," he said, "especially with the schedule like this year. But that is the expectation," end quote. And I thought that really said something about DeBoer. He's not going to duck the challenge at Alabama. I think he knows the type of expectation, the type of job he stepped into, and he knows what the mission, what the challenge is. And the challenge in year one, fairly or unfairly, and I think if you say, hey, this is Alabama, and there's still a lot of talent in that program, I do think it's kind of fair that the expectation in year one is to make the playoff. Your thoughts?
Yeah, and when you look at his salary that he got at Alabama, that's not an 8-4 record salary. And I think the fan base, and the guy's been around. He knows what he's getting into. He's obviously very confident. With his winning percentage, he should be confident. But he looks at that. So if he would have said, well, we got to first lay a foundation for our program. We've got to establish our culture. And as you pointed out, we got to get better every day. And that's our goal. We don't want to talk about championships. We just want to be the very best version of ourselves. Alabama fans would roll their eyes at that. No, you're supposed to compete for championships at Alabama. If not, you can get on down the road. We'll find somebody else. Okay? So, yeah, so that at least shows an awareness of where he knows where he is. I mean, he's not at Washington anymore. He's not at Texas Tech. He's at Alabama. Got to win, got to play for championships, got to win a few of them too.
Yeah, and the other thing that I thought was interesting, he said, I'm curious your take on this as well. I asked him how often he talks to Nick Saban. Saban is now in this like nebulous consultant role with Alabama athletics. He retains an office on campus. It's not in the same building that DeBoer's office is in. And of course, Saban's got, some other projects as well. And he works for ESPN. A little bit of a strange dynamic. You work for Alabama's athletic department and you work for ESPN, but hey, it's Nick Saban, so exceptions are made to what would be the normal rules of operation, I think. But I asked DeBoer, like, how often are you talking to Saban? And when I talked to DeBoer, which was a couple weeks ago now, at that time he said, it's been a week or two since I talked to him. He said right after he got the job, he talked to Saban a few times just to get his arms around things, get a handle on the roster, had some questions, about sort of what he was inheriting, familiarizing himself with the roster. So that makes sense. And then he said, there was a stretch there where, they didn't talk much. DeBoer was building his staff and really in the trenches with his staff. And Saban was kind of doing his own thing, the things he was involved in. And when I spoke with DeBoer, he said, yeah, I'll probably get in touch with him again later this summer. He said it's sort of a situation where anytime I need him, I can call him, get him on the phone. He's there for me if I need it, basically. But, this is not a situation where they're talking on a daily basis or even a weekly basis. And, some people may raise their eyebrows at that and say, oh, Nick Saban's at his fingertips. He's not talking to him daily. But I kind of like this. I think that's the way it should be. You don't want a situation. I mean, Nick Saban's going to cast a long enough shadow as it is, just by being Nick Saban, still by being around the athletic department. I don't think you need a situation where he's having nightly phone calls with the new coach, right? To me, this seems healthy that like Saban will pick up the phone if and when he's called by DeBoer, but they don't have a weekly time slot marked out on the calendar of here's my 30 minutes to catch up with Coach Saban. What do you think about that that situation where it's like a Saban's on call, but DeBoer can use him as much or as little as he wants.
There's not a 30 minutes carved out every day as Nick time on DeBoer's schedule. I agree that's healthy. I think you don't want to go to either extreme here. You don't want to be running to Nick Saban's office and saying, "My God, what do we do with this secondary? We just got torched. What do we do now? Why'd you recruit these guys?" No, and the other, you don't want to go the other way and just pretend Nick Saban doesn't exist. You don't want to say, "Yeah, that other coach that was here, he left us some play." No, you want to acknowledge that you're following the greatest coach of all time, a dynasty. Just a healthy, be right in the middle of there. You can't run screaming in desperation to Nick Saban. You can't ignore him either. And one part of that there's also the Nick Saban side of that. Perhaps if Nick Saban had won one national title and moved on and changed positions, and I agree, the only thing I can think he's being paid to do at Alabama is be Nick Saban. However, I will say that he has consulted with university officials in other matters outside of football. He has a long history of that. They sought his opinion on things related to the university, maybe in management and things of that nature, because he's really good at it. But I don't think Nick Saban, if he'd only won one national title, maybe he wouldn't be all that crazy about the next coach. Like, I don't want to get, I won a national championship here, and I don't want to be forgotten. I don't want some guy to blow by me and I'm forgotten. But he won 6 national titles at Alabama, one more at LSU. So he's got 6 national titles. The next guy's probably not going to win 6 national titles. So Nick Saban's place in history, his legacy at Alabama is entrenched. Nothing can change that. So he can be very generous with his advice, with his time, with no ulterior motives other than to say, I want this guy to be successful too. So I think that could be worked to his advantage. And, this thing may work out really well. It may be a best case scenario to follow a legend. Because for one thing, you have Kalen DeBoer, who has proved himself, hadn't won a national title, but he took Washington to within one win of a national title. And that 104 wins, 12 losses record speaks volumes.
Yeah. Well, he did win 3 national titles at the NAI level.
Okay. Yeah, I'm sorry.
I think that's
discount
fair.
those.
Yeah. You think the world of those NAI programs.
Yes, I do. I've got them memorized.
So, I touched on a few of the things DeBoer and I talked about throughout that interview, and he came off very calm and collected. He wasn't overly excited about this. When I asked him about running toward this challenge, I thought he gave kind of a clever answer. He said, well, it was really kind of less about going out of my way to run toward a challenge, and it was more like, this was a great opportunity, so I was interested, and I think that, that speaks to maybe his real mentality of this job. It's not like it was on his dream board to replace Nick Saban, but the Alabama job comes open. Even if you did just go to the national championship, you're at Washington. That's not Alabama. Alabama's a storied brand, great tradition, great place to recruit to, and all of that. And so, yeah, it's a great job. And when I brought up the idea of pressure, DeBoer said, well, there's a lot of other guys that would like to be in my shoes. And that's true too, right? Like, we hear so much about, you don't want to be the guy to replace the guy. Okay, maybe in a perfect world you don't. But at the end of the day, you're still Alabama's football coach. And that's still a pretty good place to be in. And I thought, you wrote something this week as well, John, on Alabama. And I thought maybe that's the most important thing in all of this is, DeBoer's talking a good game. Seems like he's got his head on straight. He's got the right outlook about all this stuff. That's all well and good. But what you say doesn't so much matter once the game starts. But what does matter is how you're recruiting. And you wrote about that this week. That was maybe the biggest question about DeBoer when Alabama hired him. Most people thought this guy knows his X's and O's. This guy knows how to coach. He won NAIA national championships. He won at Fresno State. He engineered a turnaround at warp speed at Washington. He can coach, but can he recruit to the Alabama level? Can he recruit in the South where he'd never worked before? Well, it's still early returns, but right now, he's got 20 players committed to his recruiting class, and it's ranked number 2 in the country behind only Ohio State. So far in the early going, now we know programs like Georgia, they'll charge late in recruiting. They're already putting together a pretty good class, but some of the best recruits maybe are still to come for some of these programs. But first few months into the job, DeBoer's recruiting really well, which I think answers what I think was probably the biggest question about this hire.
I didn't foresee that kind of recruiting because he's recruiting at the same level as Nick Saban did. At this stage, a limited amount of evidence, certainly. But the fact that he came out of the gates that hard and fast, to me, was really impressive because if you're hanging up there with Ohio State in recruiting, if you're just a notch below them, you're doing a job. And what's interesting to me is how he's relied on, he's almost like a best of both worlds recruiting. He's relied on his West Coast connections. 5 or 6 players from California have committed. He recruited California heavily at Washington. And we're not talking about borderline players. Most of these are 4-stars that he's getting from California. He's got, it seemed like, I think he might have at least, I don't know, it seems like 6, 7, 8 states. He's got players from all those states. Yes, there's talent in Alabama, but to be a national championship program, same with Georgia, talent in Georgia, more so than Alabama, in fact, but you still got to supplement that talent. You got to be able to, if you're a national championship caliber program, you got to be able to go anywhere and get in that recruit's door and be a contender for top flight recruits. And DeBoer's been able to do that in his very first year. I think that is really significant. Can you imagine what would have happened if he'd had a slow start in recruiting? Let's say instead of 22 commitments, he had 9 or 10 at this point. Sometimes Alabama has started slowly in recruiting, of course, close with a vengeance, but imagine the reaction to that, the certain overreaction. You don't have that now.
Let's leave the conversation there. As always, if you like what you heard today, we'd appreciate it if you hit the rate, subscribe, review button on SEC Football Unfiltered. Those ratings and reviews help us get in front of more listeners. The SEC's predicted order of finish will come out at Media Days in Dallas next week. We think Media Days should be in Hoover. The SEC didn't listen to us. It's in Dallas. In any event, predicted order of finish will be out next week. We'll see how close John and I came with our predictions of who should be in the top 5. Thanks for listening to this edition of SEC Football Unfiltered.